Tracking our growing dryness in this water year, plus any chances for rain and snow throughout California. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods, tracking what has been a prolonged period of dryness here under this ridge of high pressure, which has been blocking any moisture coming in off the Pacific. Obviously, that has been met with catastrophic situation in Southern California with a prolonged wind event. Our future winds are going to start to come down. That's at least a glimmer of hope that we'll start to see some of the extreme fire behavior come to at least an end here temporarily as we head towards the middle and end of our work week. Here's the perimeter of the Palisades fire as well as the Eaton fire. And you'll notice just north of that, we still have these offshore winds continuing into our Wednesday. We just have a small area under that red flag warning through tomorrow mid-afternoon here, just north of Thousand Oaks, more so around the Santa Clarita area. Now, most notable has been also not only the offshore winds, but these low humidities. We will start to see a shift to higher humidity once we get past just after the noontime hour for our Thursday. You'll see them come up as we start to see more of an onshore flow. So more in the way of an onshore flow, some higher humidity, not necessarily looking at precipitation, but at least this is going to take the edge off of the extreme fire weather that we've been dealing with in Southern California. Unfortunately, we had those catastrophic fires, not only deadly, but destructive fires. The latest numbers on the Palisades fire, over 23,000 acres burned, 19% contained, still mopping up some of the hot spots there around the Palisades fire. The destructive Eaton fire, 14,000 acres burned, but that doesn't account for how many structures were destroyed. Now, that has slightly better containment at 45%. Again, day by day, as we start to see less winds, less in the way of other fires breaking out, more crews can start to help to contain those fires. As far as the fire season, it is off to a big start since the beginning of the year. As of today, we've had 153 fires, over 40,000 acres burned, obviously, because these are abnormally dry conditions as well as an unusual January for us. It's going to be well above what we saw last year and well above the 5-year average. Normally, we have about 70 fires at this point in the year and only about 29 acres burned. That is due to the fact that we've had critically dry conditions in parts of Southern California. So it's been not only the start to this year's fire season, but really a continuation from last year. Until we get more measurable precipitation in Southern California, we're going to have to watch the fire danger there. We've been continuing to cover this with our extended forecasts on ABC 10 Plus. Make sure you download it wherever you stream for free on Roku, Fire TV, and Apple TV. It's live, local, and always on. We've got our explainers and weather and climate specials right there when you can kind of dig in deeper. We've got our water wasted special on there. Big topic at this point, dealing with those fires in Southern California. All right, looking at our big picture across the West, we've got what's called a Rex block. So we've got this high pressure ridge basically over much of the West, and then this little low to the south of us. This low is playing a part once it starts to press inland of initiating more of that onshore flow. It's not necessarily going to bring us precipitation, but it will kind of back off the extreme fire behavior that we've been seeing in Southern California. Because of that onshore flow, we see more of the marine layers starting to penetrate portions of the coastal communities. So that low playing a part, and again, starting to ease fire conditions. But what we don't see is a significant break in any precipitation coming our way. In fact, we're right back to that high pressure ridge building in over the weekend. If you've been following the weather pattern, you might notice that there's another low that's going to drive down the Intermountain West and settle into the Great Basin. The good news on this one, a little bit of an offshore wind event developing, but it doesn't look like the fierce Santa Ana winds will be returning for the weekend. It's a pattern we'll be following, but right now, again, it doesn't appear that we'll be seeing a big wind event develop into the weekend forecast. Instead, we start to see some cooler weather take place. We've been unseasonably warm throughout the entire state, and now you can see temperatures dropping some 10 to, in some places, 15 degrees below average. That being true not only for the Tahoe Basin, but also largely for Southern California. Most of the rest of the state just kind of getting back to near normal conditions. I wanted to dig into the climate issues, though, a little bit more on what we've been seeing this winter. This is a look at the 30-day maximum temperature departure. And what you'll notice is that the areas shaded more so in kind of the pink and even a bit in the red shade in Southern California are depicting temperatures that are well above average. Departure from normal anywhere from about 3 to almost 6 degrees above average. For our 30-day, again, looking at the averages of that maximum temperature departure, our drought.gov does a great job of just building out the weather and climate story for not only the state, but it looks at the nation as a whole. I invite you to go and just kind of browse around to that website. It's a really good one for looking deeper into longer range patterns. You'll notice Northern California, not quite as critically warm as what we've been seeing for Southern California. And that has been compounded by our precipitation departure for Southern California. Again, you can see how we're well below average for our precipitation, whereas Northern California, up to this point, has been above normal. I will, though, point out that we're starting to dig deeper into some longer range dryness, which should be one of the wettest months of the year. Our soil moisture in Southern California also critically dry, so it's giving even more fuel for if a fire is to start. It allows it to burn a little bit quicker and hotter, and then when you put winds on top of that, it helps to accelerate the spread of those fires. In Northern California, we've been kind of isolated from some of the higher fire danger because it's been such a big start to the water year. So our fire season, for all intents and purposes, pretty much came to an end by early December once we really started to see more successive storms come through, bigger atmospheric rivers that drove up those precipitation numbers. So what is the drought outlook feel like in the next month or so? Well, it does appear that we'll continue to see some development here for Southern California and also persistent drought in much of the areas that are already dealing with those drought conditions. It doesn't appear that we're calling for much in the way of development for Northern California, which will be some good news. But unfortunately, at this point, there's over 21 million people living in areas of drought in California. Since last week alone, we've seen that increase by about 15.4%. It's a situation that we're going to have to monitor because, again, this should be one of our wettest months of the year. As far as the water year goes and the drought monitor, the water year starts October 1st of the previous year and will continue through September 30th of this year. Now, when we started off the water year, things weren't looking too good throughout Northern California. We were abnormally dry. It wasn't a huge reason for concern. But then as we started off seeing those weather systems coming through in December, we started to see that erode a bit for Northern California. But unfortunately, for Southern California, it's been a completely different story. Abnormally dry conditions turn to moderate, severe, and even extreme drought conditions. So for pretty much the Los Angeles basin and continuing into some of the desert areas, we've seen that drought monitor and the categories grow here with our drought severity and coverage index now up to 108. But most of that, again, is in Southern California. But it's starting to move into parts of Central California as we start to see kind of the weather systems take a pause. I'll say a pause because there's still plenty of time to pick back up on our precipitation. Looking at some of the statistics here, Eureka, 15th wettest start to the water year, just showing the drastic difference in north to south throughout the state. Keep in mind, we span almost 700 miles from north to south in the state of California. Downtown Los Angeles, it's the second driest start to the water year. Los Angeles International Airport, though, it is the driest start, along with San Diego, and then Palm Springs, second driest start to the water year. So a very different part of the state dealing with different conditions. And again, that is aiding in elevating that fire risk as we head into our January and February months. Departure from normal, we're starting to see this grow. We were well above average when we headed into the end of December, beginning of January for much of Northern California, but now those deficits are starting to grow. Again, They're really minor. We're only about 1/4 of an inch behind for Sacramento and San Francisco. Stockton, Modesto, about 1.25 inches behind. Still above average for Eureka and Redding. And this is a big story here because that is where we have some of the biggest reservoirs in the state, which feed us into the dry summer months. Now, you can see for the month of January for downtown Sacramento that we've only had one day with precipitation, with 0.3 of an inch back on January 3rd. Prior to that, December ended up really with some great numbers, as did November for that matter. We were sitting well above average as we started off the new year. But now we're starting to consider, okay, are we starting to edge into one of the top 10 driest downtown Sacramento Januaries of all time? Well, we're right now sitting at number 8 with 0.3 of an inch of precipitation. Many of us remember 2015 when that snow tube went into the Sierra and there wasn't anything to be found. We only had 1/100th of an inch of rain in Sacramento. And just a couple years ago, 3 years ago, we only had 5/100ths of an inch of rain in Sacramento in 2022. Some other numbers here: 2007, 7/100ths of an inch, and then less than 1/4 of an inch in 1889 and 2014. Now, something to look at here is when you consider the years, if you go back to 2010, we've had 3 of the years that have been some of the driest on record in January. And in that time frame as well, we've had some pretty significant droughts. Now, talk about winter dry stretches, because this is the time of year we pick up most of our precipitation. For downtown Sacramento, the longest that we've gone without any measurable precipitation is 66 days. And that happened, again, just a couple years ago in 2022. We went from January 8th all the way through March 14th without measurable precipitation. But the longest stretch that we had is 194 days. But that happened in a time frame that we actually normally see very little in the way of precipitation. May 13th through November 22nd, 1880 is when we saw that. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the Paleoclimate Drought Index. So I did want to draw up this time scale here. And here's why I wanted to point that out. 1880 is when we had that record, and you can see we were starting to dig into a period of dryness here and abnormally dry conditions. But we were kind of pivoted here with some very wet years as well. So these were kind of some small scale incidents that we had to deal with. Now let's take a look at the last 30 years. There is a marked difference. We are seeing much more prolonged and hotter droughts that we've been dealing with. So as we dig into some of these weather conditions in the winter, where we have prolonged dryness, and also we're looking at year-to-year dryness, this is something that we have to continue to monitor, especially when we talk about fire danger. There's just not much relief. We look at prolonged dryness, bigger heat, and when these go back-to-back years, that's starting to show more of a pattern that has to be followed. Now, in the short term, our climate outlook is still calling for a likely wetter setup for the end of January and a likely drier for Southern California. It's very likely we'll see more offshore wind events as well for Southern California without a real end to the last fire season. I mentioned this a moment ago. Here's a look at the numbers. This should be one of the wettest months of the year for downtown Sacramento. February is still very wet as well. And keep in mind, November was well above average for us. December, pretty close to average. It's just January kind of hit the pause button on the weather systems coming in. But February could turn the page of the month and we could start to pick up more precipitation. And we always have the potential for a miracle March. If you're not familiar with California weather, we pick up 50% of our annual precipitation between December and February. Our peak snowpack typically hits at the end of March, and then we begin our peak snow melt, filling our reservoirs with that snow melt. And that is when we have our water at our highest demand, also at a time when we start building in our biggest heat of the year. The water year will end on September 30th, and then the whole cycle starts up again with that fall rain typically starting in October and November. And again, this year we had a really good start. Our first snow survey of the year, 91% of average for Phillips Station, where they put in that snow tube, and it was 108% for our statewide average. So the Department of Water Resources said we're going to increase that allocation to 15%. We had a strong start to the water year. There was an increase in reservoir levels. They are monitoring the soil moisture. I showed you that a moment ago, where soil moisture is critically dry in Southern California. Still looking pretty good up here in Northern California, but there is a dry long-range outlook due to that brewing La Nina, which typically favors a drier than average Southern California and a wetter than average Pacific Northwest. So here's a look at the numbers for our snowpack, which accounts for 30% of our water supply in California. As of today, we're still at about 50 to 125% of average. Now, this is real good for the Northern Sierra because, again, the Northern Sierra is going to feed our largest reservoirs with that snow melt, which will be good for water supply in the winter. Our statewide average is at 84%. And if we were to stop all precipitation from coming in, let's say we don't get any more, which is highly unlikely, for the rest of the season, we would sit at about 40% of our April 1st average when, again, we start to see more in the way of snow melt instead of snowfall. Here's a look at our major reservoir supply levels. This has been getting some headlines, too, saying, oh, we might not have any water for the dry part of the year. Well, right now, that's just simply not the case. We are at 125 to almost 130% of average for our biggest reservoirs, including Shasta, Oroville, Trinity. Trinity is a huge reservoir as well. We have about 75 to almost 80% capacity, meaning Shasta is about 77% full. It is a huge reservoir. Oroville, which also feeds part of the state, 73% full. Folsom, it's smaller. It feeds a metropolitan area for the Sacramento region, so it doesn't necessarily need to be as full. New Melones, Don Pedro, also big reservoirs, still at about 70 to almost 80% full. And then San Luis, which is that off-stream pumped water, is 107% of average and 73% capacity. And again, our water conveyance stretches from north to south, and we send that water from the north to the south along the California Aqueduct, as well as many of the smaller canals that will feed Southern California. So although the soil moisture isn't there and the precipitation hasn't been there, it is a statewide effort to make sure that everybody has access to water. It doesn't always happen. I know there are big political issues going on there, and groundwater is a big topic as well. That's why I invite you, go to our ABC 10 Plus streaming app. You can see California water wasted, California's water future. Got a lot that we dig into about California water. Here's a look at that La Nina pattern. As I mentioned, that wetter than average Pacific Northwest, drier than average typically for Southern California. We're very much playing into that. There is a hint that we'll start to see this cycle change. It's just a small pulse of indication that we may indeed start to return to at least the chance of some showers coming in January 25th. As you can see, our future moisture starting to stream in here. Here's a caveat. We've got two weather model comparisons on that day. One is saying dry, and then that European model saying wet. There's a lot to unpack as we head towards January 25th. In the meantime, it is dry, and we've got some cold overnight lows in the teens and 20s for the Sierra, 40s for afternoon highs. For the coast, it remains dry, highs in the 60s. Valley locations, highs will stay unseasonably warm. Lows will plummet into the 30s with more patchy frost in the outlook here. We are dry at least into this weekend for the mountains, the foothills, and the coast with, again, variable cloud cover, just no precipitation in the immediate forecast. Now, I am going to call for a dry outlook for this weekend. A little bit on the cooler side, still dry for next weekend. That's the weather system that I'll be looking at, though, a little bit deeper. And as we get a little bit closer to that forecast on January 25th, we'll have a better indication if we indeed start to turn things around back to a wetter weather pattern.